So it is a Friday in February. I think it's the Friday before the Super Bowl. I think the Super Bowl's this weekend. It may have already happened. I don't remember. But yesterday, I finished reading James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room. I read this as part of my gendered literature course, gender and sexuality course. So most of the discussion is based at that point, and to be fair, that's what the book is about. It's entirely focused on what does it mean to be queer, right? So the book itself, right? First published in 1956, and James Baldwin is a black gay writer, and through that, right, it's important that we know that, because our main character, the person that we're seeing the story through, is a white character that is questioning his sexuality and his role in society, right? So that's an important thing to take note of. This book feels at times so modern, and then at times so 1950s, right? It switches back and forth a lot, and it's a fantastic read, but sometimes it's just so hard because it keeps going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. But really, right, the main question that is being posed through this story is, what does it mean to be a man, and what does it mean to be a woman? Those are really the big questions that we're asking here, because for all of our characters, they have grown up and have lived in a heteronormative society, right? And David, who is our narrator, we have Hella, who is the woman that David is initially engaged to, and then we have Giovanni, who is the person that David begins to have a sexual relationship with while Hella is touring Spain, right? And so those are really kind of our three big main characters that we're talking about this, and each one of them is coming forth with this question of, what does it mean to be myself? And I think starting with Hella is the easiest, because I think her views at times are the most modern. We don't learn a lot about Hella until the very end, in which there's a conversation which Hella has with David that is just effectively about this idea of what is her role in life. And up to this point, what we have been described, and what Hella has been described as, is being a more second wave feminist, much more independent, not focused on the idea of having children or needing children to be a woman. We've had that description up to this point. And then we get to this first part of the discussion, in which she proposes that, hey, I want to settle down, and I want to have kids, and I want a man to come home to me. And what we have to ask ourselves in that moment is, do we read this in that moment as Hella submitting to the heteronormative society, or is it Hella saying that in order for her to be any sort of successful and not looked down in society, she has to do this first, right? Because the ending part of that little tidbit is her asking, is that what you want? And so that's the question, right? Is Hella saying this of, let's settle down, let's have kids, let me take care of you, let me be your rock? Is she saying this because she is buying into the heteronormative society, or is it because she sees that this is her only way to get closer to what she wants, right? Because fighting the norm constantly is hard. It's why so many people stop when the issues that surround them aren't directly affecting them. They may get upset and angry over them, but eventually that fight stops, because the fight to continuously go against the cultural norm is hard, right? Then a page and a half later, Hella begins to describe this idea of when in a relationship and a marriage, a woman can be a stranger the entire time to a man, because, going back to this idea of, if we're thinking of her being as more of a second wave feminist, is if she realizes that she has to play a role in order to get what she needs, and what she to get any sort of respect from society, well, she has to play this role, even if that's not really her. And therefore, the man that has married the woman, the man never meets the true woman. The man only ever meets this fake version that has forced themselves to confine themselves to heteronormative culture, right? So that's the bulk of Hella's, right? It's this inner conflict in her on, does she keep up this fight to not have this burden put on her, and where she's allowed to do what she wants for herself, or does she have to give up to society in order to get any semblance of what she wants? Two big things there. When we look at David, David has this constant issue in which he ties very, very strongly the idea of being a man to the idea of what sexuality is. And from a modern perspective, that is very pro-queer, right? We recognize that that's not that there are two very different things, right? But in 1950s Paris, right, and for a boy who grew up in 1950s New York and San Francisco, those two things are intrinsically entwined, especially when you look at the conversation that David overhears when he's really young between his aunt and his father. I don't want to quote the whole thing here, but basically it's just the whole thing of, well, what does it mean to be a man in his father's eyes? He doesn't want, a man is not a Sunday school teacher. And in his aunt's eyes, a man is not a bull. Well, he fights against both of them, and he becomes some sort of limbo in between. But because these are his two definitions that he's been given, he never feels like he fits in anywhere, and therefore has this really strong gender identity crisis. Also, along with that, this is the whole thing of how sexuality plays into that. Very, very constantly, David goes back into, whenever he's talking to Giovanni about could they have a life together, and David's eventual answer is, well, no, because I'm a man. What he's talking about there is this idea in which he being David, could never find himself and be comfortable with himself being openly gay all the time. He is comfortable with it and having these sort of sexual encounters in private, but he refuses to ever be open. And this is shown also through like the way that he talks about where he lives. Whenever he talks about the fact that he lives in Giovanni's room during this time in Paris, he never refers to it as, oh, he's living with someone. It is always, David always refers to it as, it is my room, but someone else who is my room that I'm renting, but there's someone else that is the owner of the room that will come and sleep in the room because he gets in fights with his mistress. Right? That's how he phrases it to the rest of the world. So David struggles a lot with being open about loving Giovanni and wanting a relationship with Giovanni. He struggles a lot with that because to him, to be gay is to not be a man. So that's that. And then there's Giovanni, who, like David, had a hetero relationship beforehand, and then moves to Paris and discovers his sexuality. Yada yada yada. I don't think there's a lot to talk specifically about Giovanni's sexuality. Another big thing with that, right, is this constant idea of what it is to be a man between Giovanni and David, and what constantly gets brought up is this idea of where they think it is demeaning to have traditionally feminine roles in their society. And then even when David goes and talks to Hella, it's still the same thing of where somehow in David's mind it is somehow diminutive to be a woman, because David seems to only be able to ever see this heterosexuality of what a woman should be in a heteronormative society. Which brings up two things. The first thing is that it brings up the kind of traditional reading of this book, in which David hates heterosexuality so much that he refuses to see any other lens than the man being a provider and the woman being a carer. He refuses to accept any other definition, refuses to learn anything else about it, because he is so unhappy with heterosexuality, right? And he frames it in that way because he would never be happy in either position, right? That's kind of the classical way of I think reading this novel. So that's super important to know, right? It's just general idea that because of the heterosexuality and heteronormative society has implanted into David. He can't see relationships any other way. He can't get over this, and therefore when it comes to trying a gay relationship with Giovanni, he can't split that apart. He feels that someone always has to be a man and someone always has to be a woman in a relationship, which from a modern perspective we understand is not true, right? So that's one thing. The other thing that I personally found really interesting was that throughout all of this, we have the constant disparaging of women's role in society constantly by a lot of our characters. It gets specifically mentioned in which when Hela returns to Paris, and she and David begin spending time together and living together. They run into Guillaume, who is another character in the novel, who is basically like a rich older gay that uses his money and his influence to prostitute out young boys. I should say young boys. Boys that are of age, but are very, very young. So it gets specifically mentioned that Hela does not like Guillaume because of a previous meeting in which he was condescending towards women, right? So throughout all of that, right, this constant disparaging of women's role in society. But then we get to the very end of the novel, in which David is imagining Giovanni being brought to execution. And what's super interesting is that, yes, they are French and they're Italian, and therefore it makes sense that the last rites that are being read to Giovanni are Catholic. But the one person, the one entity that can somehow bring deliverance to Giovanni before he's executed, or really the one entity that has the most power in all of this in Giovanni's life, becomes the Virgin Mary, which is just a weird, to me, which to me just becomes like a weird, I just say weird, an ironic twist of fate that throughout the entire novel so far, none of the males have ever wanted to be in a woman's place and have constantly thought less of women and their role in society. But at the very end, the one entity that has the most power and the control over Giovanni's life is the Virgin Mary before Giovanni is eventually executed. So yeah, that's really my thoughts on Giovanni's Room. Further things for note, comparison between the physical state of Giovanni's room and prison cells. How does the physical characteristics of the room represent the relationship between Giovanni and himself, but also Giovanni and David? Those are some other things to really focus on. In terms of the actual book, I would put it below Dorian Gray. I would much rather read Dorian Gray than this, and I think it mostly comes down to this struggle of this novel being so modern at times, and then so 1950s at others, and usually back to back, which I think is done intentionally because the Um, the melancholy that comes throughout is not because the entire thing is melancholy, but it's because the highs are immediately followed by the lows. And the same thing kind of happens here, in which the modern views and the more modernist takes on everything are immediately followed by incredibly conservative values about what roles in society are. That's that. It's a really, really great novel. Probably 6.5, I think, number-wise. I pull these numbers out of my head. I have no idea what they actually mean, but that's Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin.